Welcome to Part 8 of our lecture series on Chapter 3, Biology and Behavior. So we're going to look at heredity, which is the passing on of genes through reproduction, the genes that you inherit from your family tree. We're going to look at how our genetics can affect behavior. We're going to look at social and environmental contexts and how they influence genetic expression, and how genetic expression can be modified. One of the major ways that we can research the human condition is to use twin studies and adoption studies. And this lets us tease apart what is it about the human condition that is nature. What part of the human condition is nurture? Now, as we've talked about previously, it's really difficult to tease these apart, and nothing is just nurture or just genetics. Our genes and our environment are intertwined. But it helps for us to understand, to get a better understanding of how can we help shape the human condition when we understand the genetics of the human species and how nurture influences those genetics. So there's something called behavioral genetics methods. When we do twin studies, we will compare and contrast identical twins with fraternal twins. By comparing identical twins whom share the same DNA with fraternal twins who share about 50% of their DNA, we can analyze the influence of genetics and the influence of the environment on the human condition, on our behaviors and mental processes. As we've talked about previously, identical twins do have identical DNA at birth. But as each child explores their environment, interacts with other people, experiences social challenges, environmental challenges, their DNA changes. And so their DNA will not remain identical throughout their lifespan. We can compare fraternal twins to non-twin siblings. This gives us additional information about the influence of the environment on human behaviors and mental processes. Fraternal twins are simply non-twin siblings born at the same time. So a lot of what we're looking at when we look at fraternal twins versus non-twin siblings is, a couple of the environmental issues are, what does it mean when there's no birth order? Now, of course, with fraternal twins, one is going to say they're older than the other, but, we're talking a couple minutes. We can also look at how is it that having someone with you all the time from birth, how does that affect your behavior and mental processes? So comparing and contrasting fraternal twins with non-twin siblings gives us additional information about the human condition. So we do research with adoptees as well, with identical twins, fraternal twins, and non-twin siblings. By studying twins and non-twin siblings that have been raised separately, and yes, there are identical twins that are raised separately, we can analyze the influence of genetics and the influence of the environment on various human behaviors and mental processes. We'll talk about this some more. So, when we're looking at siblings, we look at identical twins, fraternal twins, and non-twin siblings raised together. And we look at siblings raised apart, identical twins, fraternal twins, and non-twin siblings raised apart. This gives us more information about the human condition. So I think a great example of this is looking at intelligence. intelligence is very influenced by our genetics. You're not going to have a smart kid with two less intelligent parents. There's a correlation. So when we look at, there was a study by Bouchard and McGee in 1993 looking at intelligence and genetics. Here's what they found. Identical twins raised together, the correlation coefficient was positive 0.86. That's an intense, that's a strong correlation. Identical twins raised apart, positive 0.72 correlation. Still a very strong correlation, but we do see that being raised together versus being raised apart did have some impact on the intelligence of identical twins because of the role of the environment. Fraternal twins raised together, positive 0.6, quite moderate correlation. Siblings raised together, positive 0.47. So there's a correlation, but it's not very strong. Siblings raised apart, positive 0.24. That's a very weak correlation. So what this tells us is that being raised together, when twins and siblings are raised together, these siblings are part of the environment that helps shape the genetics of intelligence. So when you have a sibling being raised with you, that does seem to give a stronger correlation between genetics and behavior. When biological parents and children lived together, the correlation was about positive 0.42. Bioparent and child living apart, that correlation plummets. So, having that parent there, being raised with the biological parent, was part of the environment that shaped intelligence manifestation, I guess. And then when the researchers looked at adoptive parent and child living together versus adopted siblings raised together, not much of a correlation for adoptive parents and children. And adopted siblings raised together, about a positive 0.32, still a very weak correlation. Now, they've done research that has found that the intelligence is definitely inherited. But I think this study does a great job of looking at how does the environment, both our social environment and physical environment, shape the genetic expression of the DNA code for intelligence, I guess. So it's interesting. I was the first woman in my family to go to college. And on my dad's side, my sister didn't graduate from high school. My mom didn't graduate from high school. I don't think her mom graduated from high school. And so I was always known as the smart kid. And my sister was the wild child. Now she was a wild child, and she's a wild adult who's very responsible but wild. So, every child in a family has their label. But my mom never thought of herself as intelligent. I mean, she knew she wasn't stupid, but she never really recognized just how intelligent she is. And so at age 56, she went back to school and got her GED. So proud of her. And of course, she finished in like the 97th 7th percentile. Her performance was astonishing. She didn't feel intelligent, but she was highly intelligent. And this comes back to the labels that we have within our families. She wasn't the smart kid in her family, but she's highly intelligent. We're just all born with our, we all have our different labels. And she wasn't considered unintelligent. She was just considered average. But my mom, I think, always felt less intelligent than me. And it didn't matter how many times I told her that intelligent people have intelligent parents. Did not matter how many times I told her that. And I also explained to her that book smarts is not intelligence. Intelligence is your ability to solve problems and to think complexly, which she's brilliant at. But once she had her GED, she needed that confirmation. And now she gets it. Now she gets it. In a study looking at identical and fraternal twins raised in homes with a high socioeconomic status, approximately 60% of the variance in IQ scores was due to genetics. Those identical and fraternal twins raised in lower socioeconomic status homes, 60% of the variance they saw that was found in IQ scores was due to environment. This tells us so much about the nurture aspect of our genetic expression for intelligence. Those kids who are raised in a high economic status home go to better schools. Their parents tend to be more educated. They're going to have friends who are going to really good schools as well. They're going to have a better diet. And these differences show a significant impact on the variance of intelligence between high socioeconomic status kids, identical and fraternal twins, and identical and fraternal twins raised in lower socioeconomic status. So the variance that was seen between identical twins and then fraternal twins, that variance was due either to high socioeconomic status or low socioeconomic status. Those who are in lower socioeconomic status homes, their schools are not going to be nearly as good. Teachers work so hard and they try. But different school districts sometimes have different funding, or parents are able to supplement their child's public education. But also we know that diet has a big role in genetic expression. With lower socioeconomic families, lower socioeconomic status homes, both parents are going to be working full-time and often more than one job. And there's going to be less availability to extracurricular sports and clubs because of the financial support required from parents for their children to join into these activities. So genes guide the development of who we are. They set up the blueprint. But our final expression of our genes throughout the lifespan is a complex interaction between genetic makeup and environmental context. So let's say two families are using the identical blueprint to build their home. But once each house is completed, they're going to look different because each family is different. same blueprint, same supplies, but things like paint and slight variations in wood structure, and there are so many different ways to make the same blueprint different. And that's the role of the environment. The blueprints guide our development, our genetic expression, but our genes guide the development of our characteristics, but nurture finalizes those genetic potentials. So your genetic makeup shapes how you respond to a given environment. Let's use introverts and extroverts. My sister is extremely extroverted, and I've tested as extremely introverted. When we go into a situation, we change the situation, but how we change it differs. Because she brings in so much energy where and interacts with everybody there, where I walk into the room and I'm much more reserved, and I'll talk to a few people, but I tend to stick with a couple people in the situation instead of talking to everybody. So introversion and extroversion is very genetic. And that shapes how we respond to a given environment. But how we respond then shapes the environment. It changes the situation. And that influences how others behave towards you. Your environment then shapes your genetic makeup in its expression in the future. Caspi did this incredible study looking at the MAO gene, MAO gene and violence, criminality. So there's an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which is set genetically. And according to his hypothesis, the MAO may be important in determining susceptibility to the effects of maltreatment in childhood, because low levels of MAO have been implicated in aggressive behaviors. So, the MAO is expressed in two ways. Some people have the lower form, and some have the higher level of MAO. So for this study, Caspi recruited more than 100,000 New Zealanders, and he did a longitudinal study. He followed these children from birth into early adulthood. And as part of this study, they measured which children were mistreated by their parents. So that's nurture. Then researchers measured the presence of the MAO gene. So did the subject have the higher level of MAO, or did they have the lower level of MAO? And the results are astonishing. What Caspi found was that those who had the gene for low MAO activity were much more likely than others to have been convicted of violent crimes if they had been maltreated as children. This lets us see the nature-nurture. The effects of maltreatment had less influence on those with the high MAO gene. So here we've got our chart. Those children in green were not mistreated during childhood. Those in blue were probably maltreated, and those in orange were severely maltreated. So here we have the subject group with low MAO activity. Here we have the subject group for high MAO activity. and we're looking at conviction of violent offenses. As you can see, those children maltreated, probable to severe maltreatment during childhood, who had a low MAO, were significantly more likely to convict violent offenses, where those who had high MAO activity, most of these subjects were not committing as many violent offenses. This gives us a look at the genetics of aggressive behavior, because again, these are violent offenses. With selective breeding, we are able to do significant genetic manipulation in mammals such as mice and rats. When we're doing this kind of manipulation, we need species that don't live very long because we have to selectively breed them. So this is not stuff that we do with human subjects. It's just hard to do it in human subjects, and there's a lot of ethical issues about should we go and selectively breed humans. In my opinion, absolutely not. I think that's extremely unethical, and the science community agrees with me. So with animal studies using selective breeding, researchers can knock out genes. So they can turn genes on and off through selective breeding to determine their effects on behaviors and on disease. And this gives us a huge amount of information about genetic influence. So at the beginning of this chapter or last chapter, you watched a video on epigenetics, and they showed you two mouse groups, and they had done knockout breeding. And so you saw one group of mice were really fat. They were really overweight. The other group were normal weight. Researchers were using knockout techniques so that they could see how the genetic expression influenced the weight in these mice, and looked at their genetic code. It's really quite astonishing. We know environmental factors modify genetic expression, and we've talked a lot about epigenetics. That is how environmental factors modify genetic expression. Because we know this, we're now able to shape our own environment, and the choices we make can influence our future. Your genes are not your destiny. How your genes modify themselves over the lifespan is shaped by the choices that you make, the environments that you put yourself into. So we've talked a lot about epigenetics. This is just how the environment affects genetic expression. So researchers are looking at the processes by which the environment affects genetic expression, and research is going on keeps going on this because we're finding that the environment plays a huge role in our genetic expression. And that's kind of newer research, partially because we finally mapped the human genome in the 90s, and we needed that piece of the puzzle before we could look at the role of the environment on DNA. So the potential implications of epigenetics for understanding health problems and health benefits are enormous. And these have shaped medical science as far as what the advice that doctors give their patients. How to be healthier, when someone comes in and they have a chronic health condition, how can we use epigenetic changes to improve their quality of life? And we know that human behavior and mental processes are formed through complex and intricate nature-nurture relationship. Research on this is making this very clear, that this relationship between nature and nurture is much more complex than we believed. So while we are born with specific genetic predispositions, our environment must trigger those predispositions. So when you answered your form question last week on colon cancer, I was Andrew. I'm still waiting to do my genetic test. Because of COVID, my family we had to postpone our genetic testing, but my dad has FAP, which is really, really bad. He goes to colonoscopies once a year, which is astonishingly frequent because of FAP. And the only way to know if my sister and I have inherited this is for each of us to be genetically tested. And the genetic testing will give our doctors a tremendous amount of information about my future and Lori's future with colon cancer. One of the reasons Lori wants to get tested is she's got 3 children. And so, if she tests positive, she'll have her girls tested. And because they're young, early, mid-20s, youngest is 17, they have a lot more time to shape their environment to keep this genetic predisposition from triggering. So in this chapter, we have looked at the nature-nurture debate in detail. We've looked at how we research the nature-nurture question. We looked at neurons and neural communication. We've looked at brain structures holistically and as individual structures. We looked at how the brain changes in response to genetics. And we've looked at environmental factors and how damage can significantly alter our genetic expression. So that is our final lecture for this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.